What's up guys, Dr. Shepard here, and we are going to talk about ADHD today. This is one of the most highly requested topics, so I want to give you guys some more information on what an ADHD diagnosis actually is, and how we can tell if ADHD might be the cause of some of the person's symptoms. By the way, hopefully you love my Orioles shirt. Went to med school right outside the Orioles Stadium and it was amazing. But anyways, I digress, probably because of my own ADHD. We're talking about the questions that I ask my patients to try and figure out whether they might have a diagnosis of ADHD. And I think this is important because we can read about the different symptoms of ADHD online, but it can be kind of hard to interpret that in sort of a concrete sense, like, okay, ADHD is characterized by inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. Okay, well, what does that actually mean in real life? Like, what does that look like to be more impulsive, more hyperactive, more inattentive? Let's talk about some of the questions that I ask. I think this is a super important topic because there are so many people that go undiagnosed for many, many years, just not realizing that some of the daily struggles that they have to face are actually due to a treatable medical condition. It can be so validating when you've had these struggles your entire life and you feel like there's something wrong with you, and then one day you realize it's been ADHD. It all makes sense. You don't even necessarily have to get your ADHD symptoms treated with medication or therapy or getting like an ADHD coach or an executive functioning coach, whatever it may be. There are lots of strategies that you can use, and I think just knowing that this is something that you might be dealing with can be really empowering and can enable you to find other ways of potentially dealing with some of the problems that you may face. ADHD is what we call a neurodevelopmental disorder, which basically means it's present from birth throughout your lifetime. So that's important because you have only ever known this one brain, and some of the ways that you do things might seem totally natural because that's the way you've always done them. So talking about the actual symptoms, what does ADHD look like day-to-day life, is super important because it helps us figure out, maybe I'm not as dysfunctional as I thought. Maybe there's just something else going on that I hadn't considered. You're not dysfunctional, whether it's ADHD or not. But people with ADHD tend to internalize a lot of the struggles that they face because they don't realize that it's out of their control. They just get frustrated and they're like, if I just tried harder, if I was just smarter, if I was just whatever. None of that is true. There are also a lot of really beautiful things about having ADHD. We tend to be more creative, more entrepreneurial, and a lot of other really cool things that we can talk about later if you guys want to. But first step is recognizing if there's an issue. So let's talk about the questions that I ask my patients to try and figure out whether they might have ADHD. And of course, as with all my videos, this is not meant to be medical advice. It is not meant to take the place of a proper evaluation by a trained mental health professional. Ultimately, that's the only way to really know for sure whether or not what you're dealing with is ADHD. This is really meant to be educational and to help you think through some of these symptoms so that you then have a better understanding of what your symptoms might be and how you can talk about them with your doctor. You don't necessarily need to have all of these symptoms in order to have a diagnosis of ADHD. And this is not an exhaustive list. So there are plenty of other symptoms that I didn't include on this list. These are just some of the things that I see frequently in my own practice. And this isn't some specialized validated tool for the diagnosis of ADHD. These are just things that I observe that tip me off that there might be something like ADHD going on in this person. It's also important to note that many of these symptoms can come up in other psychiatric disorders as well, and many of these symptoms can be present in people who do not have a psychiatric disorder. It all kind of comes down to the severity of the symptoms and the frequency of the symptoms. So if you are a little bit forgetful, but it doesn't really interfere with your day-to-day functioning, it's not really something that's persistent and really bothersome, then we we wouldn't necessarily consider it something that is a symptom of a broader disorder. We can all be forgetful sometimes, but these symptoms are present in people with ADHD to a greater extent than they would be in someone without ADHD. All right, question number 1. Do you find yourself frequently daydreaming or having trouble concentrating? This can be especially obvious if somebody is sitting in class or sitting in a meeting and they realize, well, I haven't been paying attention for like the past 5 minutes. I have no idea what was being said, and you kind of snap back into it for a minute. Again, that can happen if you don't have ADHD, but it happens more often and can be more impairing in someone who does have ADHD. So, for example, it might be to the point where your boss or your teacher notices and calls you out for it. This is an example of one of the inattentive symptoms that we see in people with ADHD, just difficulty focusing, difficulty paying attention to one specific task, especially if it's something kind of boring, like a lecture or a meeting. Question number 2, do you find yourself feeling restless or unable to sit still? Many people with ADHD describe a feeling of just having to move. Like, I feel like I need to be on the go. I feel like I'm almost like itchy from the inside. This is described in the DSM as feeling like you're driven by a motor. So just feeling like you have to get up and move. This kind of touches on the hyperactive side of ADHD. So these are the kids that were constantly up and down in their chairs in school, running around the classroom, could not wait for recess, that kind of thing. Question number 3. Do you find that you tend to tap your foot, bounce your leg, twirl your hair, pick at your cuticles, all of that stuff? Again, this kind of gets to the hyperactivity piece. People with ADHD tend to get really bored, and it's so hard to just sit there and focus. I am literally picking my cuticle right now. That's what I mean. Even if you're engaged in something where you're trying to pay attention, your mind has to be doing like 1,000 different things at the same time. So sometimes you can run into trouble with this. So there are people who pick their cuticles until they bleed, or they just are constantly, again, on the move and can get in trouble for that. But can definitely be another sign of ADHD. Question number 4, do you find yourself always being just a little bit late to everything? Sometimes a lot late. Or being excessively early to things because you're so afraid that you're going to be late. This is one of the classic symptoms that we see with ADHD, but it's actually not in the diagnostic criteria for the disorder. It kind of falls under the umbrella of executive dysfunction. So basically just difficulty with coordinating, planning, and in this case, the difficulty planning is in regard to time. So people with ADHD often have what we call time blindness, which means that we have a really hard time paying attention to how much time has passed. So people with ADHD just have a really hard time with their own internal clocks, and this can manifest as being constantly late. Or if you are someone who's gotten into a lot of trouble being late, you probably learned pretty quickly to way overestimate how long it's going to take you to get somewhere, and you overcompensate for that by being extremely early. Question number 5 kind of piggybacks on the concept of time blindness. So I asked people if they tend to have a really hard time telling how long it's going to take them to do something, even if it's a project that they do all the time or a task that they complete all the time. So for example, at work, after I'm done seeing patients for the day, I take time to write my notes, wrap up what I'm doing, take care of any like last minute tasks, and then I head home. So usually I send my husband a text like, hey, just finished with my last patient. I should be headed home soon. I'm thinking I'll probably be another 30 minutes. This poor man has learned to make that at least another hour, because even though it's something that I do every day, wrapping up the day, getting finished with work, I still have a really hard time trying to figure out how long it's gonna take me to complete all the tasks I have to do. Again, this is some executive dysfunction, right? So you're having trouble planning, okay, how many tasks do I have to do to complete this one larger task, and how long is it going to take me to get through each of those subtasks. Plus your internal clock is maybe not the greatest, and it leads to difficulty estimating how long it's going to take you to do stuff. This might also be why you end up rushing at the last minute to get everything done, because you don't have a great sense of how long that project is going to take you. Question number 6. Do you feel embarrassed by the state of your home or your car or your workspace because of how messy it is, no matter how hard you try to keep it tidy? And this is usually not like messy, disgusting messy. It's usually disorganized, cluttered messy. People with ADHD have trouble telling, first of all, what's important and what's not important. So we tend to hold on to everything. As you can imagine, that makes things into a cluttered mess. People with ADHD can also have a lot of trouble prioritizing organization because they find it really difficult and it's kind of a draining task. So it's something they might put off. They also have a lot of trouble finishing a task once they've started. So a lot of the disorganization is like halfway completed projects or stacks of paper or whatever that they've started and then just haven't finished. And again, this can be present in people who don't have ADHD, but it's a consistent problem if you are someone with ADHD. And people beat themselves up about this one a lot. You feel so embarrassed by the fact that your home is so messy. You will panic clean on days where you know somebody is going to be headed over, and you totally swear to yourself that next time you're not gonna let it get this bad, but despite your best efforts, you just can't keep it clean and organized in a way that's sustainable. And by the way, if this is something you struggle with, I have some amazing books that I've read that have been super helpful for me. I have them linked below if you're interested. If you do struggle with this piece of organization and you feel like you need a little help, check them out for sure. All right, question number 7. I ask my patients if they tend to have trouble organizing or beginning a task or a project. So for example, if they're trying to write a paper, they might have a lot of trouble getting through an outline. And many people with ADHD write papers in a way that would make a non-ADHD person rip their hair out. We will start with the middle, we will add over here, we will put this detail up here, we will write this paragraph incredibly detailed, we'll do half an outline, and somehow it comes together at some point, usually, mostly, kind of. But we have a lot of trouble just sitting down and being like, okay, outline from here to here. It is a skill that you have to practice whether or not you have ADHD, but it is on hard mode when you do have ADHD. So telltale sign of this is if you were like in middle school and you had to write a paper and you would write the paper and like be finished with all of that and be like, oh crap, they wanted to see the outline or the rough draft or whatever before I turned in the paper. So you have to go back and like make up an outline even though you already did the paper. But this is why it can be so damaging to your self-esteem to not have your ADHD diagnosed as a kid, because school is not made for people with ADHD. It's just not built for us. Okay, on to question number 8. I ask people if they have difficulty completing one task at a time. People with ADHD are the people that have 8 books that they are reading simultaneously, not because they are expert speed readers, but because they can't decide which book they want to finish and they get bored with one and they start another and can't remember which one they started or left out or whatever. They also do things like start cleaning in their kitchen and they find maybe one of their books in the kitchen, so they go to put it away on their bookshelf, and before they know it, an hour has passed and they didn't clean their kitchen like they meant to, but their entire bookshelf is now alphabetized and placed like as a beautiful rainbow color coordinated pile of books. You can't get that one task done. You keep getting pulled off into different directions because your brain is like, oh, that's a shiny, exciting thing. Like, I'd rather do that than do this boring task. Again, shout out to those books below because they've given me some great ways to kind of deal with some of this distraction when you're trying to clean. And this is also something that we can talk about in a future YouTube video if you guys are interested in learning more about some of these strategies. Okay, question number 9. Do you have a hard time relaxing or winding down? People with ADHD will commonly tell me that they have essentially no downtime because they simply cannot handle it. I cannot tell you the last time that I watched a movie all the way through. Many people with ADHD cannot sit still comfortably enough to engage in something like a leisure activity without their mind just being all over the place. And it ends up honestly being more draining than it is relaxing. So they tend to way overschedule themselves, or they tend to do 2 other things while they're engaging in a leisure activity. So probably the most common thing nowadays is to just be flipping on your phone, reading through text messages, on social media, whatever, while you're watching a movie, while you're intermittently getting up to put away some of the toys that are scattered around the living room. I think this can also be a little bit of a coping mechanism too, because I think those of us with ADHD have a really hard time kind of calming our minds down and having our minds kind of slow down and stop the rat race. And the best way to get your mind to be still and quiet, that most of us find, is to just keep yourself busy so you don't have to think about all of the thoughts that are going on in your head. As an aside, mindfulness meditation is an amazing skill for people with ADHD to work on, in part because it allows you to observe some of those racing thoughts without necessarily getting caught up or following each and every one of them. And it also enables you to train that mindfulness muscle. So if you're doing mindfulness meditation, for example, part of that is going to be bringing your brain back to the present moment whenever it drifts off. And obviously, if you have ADHD, you have difficulty paying attention. So that can be a great way to practice focusing your attention and building that attention muscle. All right, question number 10. I ask people if they tend to have trouble sleeping because they find it really hard to turn their minds off. Again, this goes back to the relaxation thing. Our minds tend to be racing all the time, and it's not like as soon as your head hits the pillow, the ADHD goes away. It's still there. Your mind's still going and racing, and even if you're exhausted, you may still be thinking about a lot of different things. This can end up really impairing your ability to get some good rest and can be something that even sets off insomnia for some people. One way I try to deal with this is by having a notepad by my bed so I can just quickly jot down any really nagging thoughts that are just rolling around in my head. Okay, question number 11. This one has to do with eating habits. So I ask people whether they find that they struggle with overeating, binge eating, or even compulsively eating. So I hear you. You're thinking, what in the world does eating have to do with my ADHD? It's the same thing. You're having trouble paying attention. You're more impulsive than the average person. Well, there's a lot of different factors involved, but people with ADHD can have certain sensitivities, so they may be more sensitive to certain tastes or textures than other people. People with ADHD can also be impulsive, so we tend to be on the classic seafood diet where you see food and you eat it. We tend to have trouble stopping, again, because of that impulsivity. If we are eating something that we really like, we are going to be impulsive about it, and we're going to have a lot of trouble tearing ourselves away. In some ways, people with ADHD also have a difficult time imagining themselves outside of the present moment, which sounds like it would be a good thing, but in some cases that can get us into a lot of trouble. In regards to eating, for example, you may be really enjoying that buffet, but you can't sort of imagine yourself in the future. And because you're really enjoying it, you continue eating instead of what the average person may do, which is envision themselves 3 hours later locked to their toilet because they ate way too much General Tso's. Same thing with past experiences. So people with ADHD also have trouble remembering that the last 8 times they crushed the buffet, they felt like they couldn't move for 2 days. So they just focus on the present moment. This feels good, so I'm gonna keep doing it. Again, they're very present focused. They just think about, hey, this feels good, so I'm gonna keep doing it. On the flip side, sometimes if you have ADHD, you get so hyper-focused that you don't do the things that other people normally do, and sometimes this includes eating. So there was one day a couple of weeks ago where I left my lunch in the microwave for like a total of 5 hours. So like I heated up my lunch, it was all done, like ready to go, got distracted. 5 hours later, I was like, man, I'm really hungry. Wonder why, Melissa? I wonder why. The eating the same foods over and over thing, that can be sort of a hyperfixation, I find. So we get into one certain food and then that's like all we can eat, all we think about. It can also sometimes be related to the texture sensitivity thing or the taste sensitivity thing. We just happen to find a food that jives with our unique sensitivities and we roll with it. I'm actually remembering this study that I read recently that showed that many people that get evaluated for weight loss surgeries, so things like gastric bypass surgeries, actually have undiagnosed ADHD, and in many cases that's contributing to an eating disorder. All right, question number 12. When I'm thinking somebody may be dealing with ADHD, I ask them whether they tend to do pretty well on complicated questions and then miss really straightforward things. I ask them whether they recall on tests and assignments that they tended to do pretty well on complicated things. They clearly knew the material, but then would make really silly errors or mess up simple answers. It's a pretty classic sign of inattention. When we are dealing with a complicated topic or a question that's really difficult, we sort of have our full attention on that question. But then when we get to one of the more simple, sort of low stress questions, we kind of let our guard down and the inattention takes over and we miss it. This can be so frustrating for parents, for kids, for teachers, because you see that the kid knows the answer. The kid like totally understands the material, but they miss it like last second. And that's again something that kids can really internalize. They beat themselves up over it. They think they're stupid, when in reality, it's simply a problem of attention. Question number 13, we kind of hinted at this earlier when we talked about things being really disorganized or messy. But people with ADHD have a lot of trouble throwing things away, so they end up keeping everything by default. This can be caused by a bunch of different factors, but one of them that I find really interesting is that people with ADHD tend to be pretty empathic and they tend to assign emotional value to things that maybe other people wouldn't assign the same emotional value to. So for example, maybe your mom gave you a card 10 years ago that was just sort of a one-off, like not particularly special thing. You may have a really hard time throwing that away, whereas someone else may not think anything of it. It may also be related to the difficulty in kind of thinking about the future or thinking about the past. You have trouble thinking past the present moment, so you're like, well, I'm not really sure, maybe I would need this, maybe not, I'm just gonna keep it. You get overwhelmed by the different possibilities and having to like think through everything, so you kind of shut down and just the default state is to keep it. Question number 14, do you tend to lose essential everyday items like your keys, your phone, your wallet, whatever it may be? This can be so frustrating because you put it down and you're like, I'm putting my phone there. I'm telling myself I'm putting my phone there so that I remember I put my phone there so that in 5 minutes I know where my phone is. It's gone. Then it's gone. It's gone out of your brain instantly. You have no idea where your phone is. No idea. Putting things in the same place over and over again can certainly help. But again, it's not truly that you have a memory problem, which a lot of people think. I have people that come to me and say like, am I gonna get dementia because I never remember where I put my stuff? But in reality, it's been something that's been going on for a very long time, and it's not that they can't remember things, it's that they're not able to pay attention enough to encode or put into their mind where the thing is in order to then remember that later on. So again, there are some great strategies that we can talk about to try and help you remember this kind of stuff. There are also great products like Tile. This is a little teeny, not very intrusive disc that you can put into your wallet or attach to your keys or your phone that basically acts like a tracker. All right, question number 15. I ask people if they tend to find that they are more sensitive to criticism and rejection than the average person. This is something that we call rejection sensitive dysphoria. It's something we see in people with ADHD where we tend to pick up on criticism and rejection more easily, perhaps because we've been criticized more than the average person has due to our ADHD symptoms. But we also are genuinely just more sensitive to criticism. Just like with the sensory sensitivities that we see in people's food preferences, we can see that in regards to relationships and social situations too. The ADHD brain is just highly sensitive, and that extends to sensitivity about the way that others treat us. Question number 16. Do you find yourself getting distracted while driving or doing some other dangerous task, even to the point where you have been in more accidents than the average person, or you've gotten more speeding tickets than the average person? This is something I see all the time. And this is kind of like that other question where we talked about doing okay on the complicated stuff and not doing so well on the simple questions. People with ADHD can be great drivers in intense situations. They can like really focus and do a really great job, and then they run into a pole in an empty parking lot. Not at all from any personal experience or anything. They're usually fine drivers. They're great drivers. They're good, but they let their guard down and the inattention takes over, and before they realize it, they're going 90 miles an hour in a 70, or they're hitting a pole in an empty parking lot. All right, let's move on to question number 17. This is the last one. There's so much more to talk about with ADHD, but I will leave it here because you guys probably have ADHD too and are probably struggling through this video right now. I am so sorry. Hopefully you can watch it on like double speed or something. Anyways, so number 17 is, do you feel like you are easily overwhelmed in busy or loud environments? Again, this comes back to the sensitivity of the ADHD brain. We are more sensitive to stimulation. The nervous system gets excited and overactivated more easily. And so things like loud noises, like fireworks or music, or even somebody talking, is going to be much more distracting and even annoying or infuriating. Whereas in someone who didn't have ADHD, it wouldn't be so stimulating. People with ADHD also tend to get very overwhelmed in busy environments. So you'll notice maybe when you go to a store, if it's a really busy time there, you'll feel super overwhelmed. You'll be like, okay, I just gotta get out of here, gotta get done and get out of here. Again, you're picking up on all of the different sights and sounds to the nth degree that other people may not even notice, may very easily block out. Phew, okay, that was a lot. Like I said, so much more to talk about with ADHD, but that at least kind of gives you a good starting point about what kind of symptoms you may be looking for, and hopefully also some language that you can take to your doctor, your therapist, to talk about, okay, these are the symptoms that I'm seeing. I understand that these might be related to ADHD in some people. What do you think? Thankfully, ADHD is something that we have a pretty good handle on as far as how to manage symptoms, ways that you can cope, ways that you can get help. And again, I'll link some of those resources below. I also have a resources section on my website that has a bunch more information. And whether or not you choose to take medications, it can still be really valuable to talk with a mental health professional about whether this might be what's going on with you. Big part of the reason that I decided to get started on social media is because I really do think that knowledge is power, and I think it's important to have the knowledge of, okay, this is what's going on with me. Even if you decide not to change what you're doing, having that knowledge and understanding what's going on can be so, so helpful. So I hope this helped. Please let me know if you have questions in the comments down below. I'll try to address them in future videos. I also do a lot more ADHD education on Instagram and TikTok, so check those out if you haven't already. And if this has been helpful, it would be awesome if you would give it a like and a subscribe. That definitely helps me know what content is helpful for you guys, what you want to see more of in the future. If you have ADHD and you have stuck with me through the end of this video, kudos to you. I could barely get through it myself. Hopefully we'll add some like snazzy editing. I don't know, make it more bearable. Anyways, thanks for hanging with me, guys. I will see you next time.